Tonight, let your mind drift back through the centuries, to a city of bells and candle smoke, of marble columns warmed by the sun and shadowed corridors cooled by stone. We are traveling to Rome, not the Rome of postcards and tourists, but the Rome of whispers, secrets, incense, and ambition. This is a gentle journey through the stories of some of the most troubled and controversial popes in history. Not to judge them too harshly, and not to stir anger, but to understand how even the highest offices can be touched by very human weakness. Settle in, breathe slowly. History, like a great river, flows with both clear and muddy waters. Tonight, we follow the darker currents, softly. Long ago, when the Roman Empire had only recently faded and the Church was still finding its footing, the papacy was not the stable institution we might imagine today. It was fragile, vulnerable, caught between kings, emperors, and powerful Roman families. One of the earliest figures often mentioned in hushed tones is Pope Stephen VI. His name echoes through time because of a strange and unsettling event known as the Cadaver Synod. Imagine Rome in the year 897. The air is tense. Political factions pull at the city like rival winds. Stephen, anxious and embattled, orders the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, to be exhumed from its tomb. In a dimly lit basilica, the corpse dressed in papal vestments is placed on a throne. A trial is held, charges are read aloud. A deacon answers for the silent body. The scene, by any measure, is surreal and grim. The verdict, guilty. The corpse is stripped of its vestments. 3 fingers of blessing are cut off. The body is cast into the Tiber River. It sounds like a fevered dream, yet it happened. Stephen's reign did not last long after this spectacle. Public outrage swelled like a storm. He was imprisoned and eventually strangled. Rome moved on, as it always does, stones absorbing scandal, bells ringing again. But the turbulence did not end there. Centuries later, during what historians sometimes called the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, Rome's noble families treated the papal throne almost like a family inheritance. Power was traded, influence was bartered. Morality often bent under the weight of ambition. Enter Pope John XII, elected in 955. He was very young, perhaps only 18. Youth can bring energy and hope. But in John's case, it brought recklessness. Contemporary accounts accuse him of turning the Lateran Palace into a place of indulgence rather than prayer. Stories spread of gambling, of banquets, of behavior unfit for the spiritual leader of Western Christendom. It is difficult to separate fact from exaggeration. Chroniclers often had their own loyalties and grudges. But what is certain is that John XII's life ended violently. He died suddenly, reportedly struck down, some said by a jealous husband, others by illness. His brief papacy remains a symbol of how the office could be overshadowed by personal vice. Breathe in, breathe out. These are not tales of monsters, but of flawed men in immense positions of power. Then there is Benedict IX, one of the most astonishing figures in papal history. He became pope as a young man, thanks largely to the influence of his powerful family. But unlike most popes, Benedict did not serve just once. He was pope 3 separate times in the 11th century. Imagine the confusion of Rome during those years. Benedict's behavior scandalized many. Accusations ranged from corruption to immorality. At one point, wishing to marry, he allegedly sold the papacy to his godfather, who became Pope Gregory VI. Yes, sold it. The papacy, treated like property. Later, Benedict returned, reclaiming the throne. Eventually, he faded into obscurity. His story sounds almost unbelievable, yet it is a reminder that institutions can stumble before reform finds its footing. And reform did come. The Church would experience movements of renewal. But even in later centuries, controversy lingered. In the Renaissance, when art blossomed and Rome shimmered with new beauty, some popes were as much princes as priests. They commissioned grand basilicas, sponsored artists, and navigated the political chessboard of Europe. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, is perhaps the most infamous of them all. His name has become synonymous with intrigue. He openly acknowledged several children and advanced their positions, blending family loyalty with church politics. Stories swirl around him: poisonings, secret alliances, lavish feasts. Some tales are likely embellished by enemies. Yet it is undeniable that Alexander's papacy was marked by intense political maneuvering and nepotism. His son, Cesare Borgia, became a figure both feared and admired, inspiring even Machiavelli. Under Alexander, Rome was a city of splendor and suspicion. Renaissance sunlight glinted off marble domes while shadows lengthened in corridors of power. Still, the church endured. A century later, during the time of the Reformation, Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, sat on the throne of Peter. He loved art, music, and celebration. His court sparkled with culture. Yet the construction of St. Peter's Basilica required enormous funds. The sale of indulgences certificates believed to reduce punishment for sins became widespread. It was this practice that ignited Martin Luther's protest in 1517. Whether Leo foresaw the consequences or not, the spark he allowed to burn would lead to a firestorm. Christendom fractured. Wars of religion followed. Europe changed forever. Sometimes, the worst outcomes are not born of cruelty but of complacency. As the centuries turned, the papacy transformed. The age of warrior popes and princely courts gradually faded. The modern era brought different challenges: nationalism, revolution, world wars. Pope Pius IX began his reign in 1846 with reformist hopes. But as revolutions swept Europe, he grew increasingly conservative. He declared the dogma of papal infallibility in 1870, strengthening the spiritual authority of the Pope, but also deepening divisions with those who feared centralization. He witnessed the loss of the Papal States, territories long ruled by the Church. The Pope became a prisoner in the Vatican, refusing to leave its walls for years. His long reign was marked by both devotion and controversy. Then came the 20th century with its shadows. Pope Pius XII led the Church during World War II. His legacy remains debated. Some argue he worked quietly behind the scenes to save lives. Others criticize him for not speaking out more forcefully against the horrors of the Holocaust. History here is complex and painful. Silence can be interpreted in many ways: prudence, fear, diplomacy, or moral failure. Scholars continue to study documents, seeking clarity. As you listen, notice how each era reflects its own storms. Popes did not exist in isolation. They were shaped by the world around them, by politics, by war, by culture. It is easy, perhaps, to label someone the worst, but history is rarely so simple. Some popes were undeniably corrupt. Some were weak. Some were caught in tides too strong to resist. And yet, through all of it, the institution persisted. Reform movements rose. Councils were called. Standards were clarified. The medieval papacy that once held cadaver trials eventually gave way to structured canon law. The Renaissance court of intrigue evolved into a more bureaucratic administration. The modern Vatican operates with diplomatic networks and global communication unimaginable to earlier centuries. If you imagine the papacy as an ancient tree, you can see how storms bent its branches. Some limbs broke. Some bark was scarred. Yet the trunk remained, rings marking centuries of growth and trial. Tonight, as you grow drowsy, let the image of Rome soften. The Colosseum stands in quiet moonlight. The Tiber flows steadily, as it did when Formosa's body was cast into its waters. The bells of St. Peter's ring, as they did in ages of both scandal and sanctity. History is not a straight path of light. It is a tapestry of human striving, ambition, and devotion woven together. The so-called worst popes remind us of something deeply human. Power tests character. When faith and authority mix with politics, the results can be unpredictable. And yet, for every troubled reign, there were also reformers. For every scandal, a saint. The same institution that produced controversy also produced figures of humility and courage. As sleep draws near, consider this gentle thought. Even flawed chapters belong to the larger story. Without them, reform might never come. Without mistakes, growth might not happen. The candles in ancient basilicas flicker low. Marble floors cool beneath your feet. The voices of cardinals fade into echoes. The centuries settle like dust, quiet and still. Let the stories dissolve into the night. Let judgment soften into understanding. Rome rests now as you will soon. Breathe in. Breathe out. The river keeps flowing. The river keeps flowing, and with it, the centuries turn like slow, heavy pages in a very old book. As the night deepens, let us wander further along the worn cobblestones of history. The lamps are dim here. The air is cool. We are still in Rome, but time has shifted again. There were moments when the papacy seemed less like a spiritual calling and more like a crown balanced precariously atop a restless city. Noble families competed for influence, and the papal tiara glittered like a prize in a contest that had little to do with prayer. During the 11th and 12th centuries, reform movements tried to pull the church away from corruption. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, had become common in parts of Europe. Some popes fought fiercely against it. Others were accused of benefiting from it. Imagine the tension of those days. Messengers on horseback carrying letters sealed in wax. Bishops arguing in stone halls. Kings insisting on their right to appoint clergy. The investiture controversy unfolded like a drawn-out storm between popes and emperors. Pope Gregory VII clashed with Emperor Henry IV in a dramatic struggle over authority. Though Gregory is often remembered as a reformer rather than among the worst, the conflict revealed how entangled the papacy had become in worldly power. Excommunications were not merely spiritual acts. They were political weapons. To be cut off from the church could mean rebellion among your subjects. To be reinstated could restore your throne. The lines between heaven and earth blurred. Centuries later, the Avignon papacy would cast a long shadow. In 1309, the papal court moved from Rome to Avignon in what is now France. For nearly 70 years, popes resided there instead of in Rome. Critics later called it the Babylonian captivity of the church. The French crown exerted heavy influence. Taxes increased. Administrative machinery expanded. Many felt the papacy had become too political, too national, too distant from its spiritual roots. When the papacy finally returned to Rome, unity did not follow. Instead, the Western Schism erupted in 1378. 2 men, then eventually 3, claimed to be the true pope. One in Rome, one in Avignon. Later, a third elected by a council hoping to solve the problem. Imagine being a believer in those years. Which pope was legitimate? Which excommunication counted? Which bishop was truly appointed? It must have felt like watching the sky split in two. The rival popes excommunicated one another. They gathered supporters among European kingdoms. Loyalties divided along political lines. For nearly 40 years confusion reigned. Only the Council of Constance in 1417 restored a single recognized pope. It was a wound that took time to heal. And yet, amid chaos, art still flourished. Cathedrals still rose. Monks still prayed in quiet monasteries. The faith of ordinary people continued, often untouched by the intrigues above. The Renaissance returned us to brilliance and to excess. Pope Julius II, sometimes called the warrior pope, donned armor and led troops into battle. He sought to reclaim territories for the papal states and strengthen Rome's political position. It is a curious image, a pope on horseback, sword at his side. Yet he also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Under his reign, beauty blossomed. Art and ambition intertwined. Is he among the worst? Some critics say his militarism overshadowed his spiritual duties. Others argue he protected the independence of the papacy in a turbulent time. History rarely offers simple answers. The centuries pressed on. The Reformation fractured Europe. The Counter-Reformation reshaped Catholic identity. Councils clarified doctrine. New religious orders arose, including the Jesuits, emphasizing education and missionary work. By the time we reached the 18th and 19th centuries, the nature of scandal had changed. No longer were popes accused of hosting decadent banquets in palace halls. Instead, they wrestled with modernity, science, democracy, secularism. Pope Gregory XVI condemned certain modern ideas, fearing they would erode faith. Pope Pius IX, as we mentioned, responded to revolution with retrenchment. The loss of the Papal States in 1870 marked a dramatic shift. The Pope's temporal power shrank to the small territory of the Vatican. Paradoxically, as political territory diminished, spiritual authority consolidated. The 20th century brought new test ideologies that reshaped the globe. Fascism, Nazism, communism, global war. Pope Pius XI confronted rising totalitarian regimes. He signed agreements like the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which established Vatican City as an independent state. It was a moment of diplomatic achievement, resolving decades of tension between Italy and the papacy. But the shadows lengthened as dictators tightened their grip across Europe. Pius XII's reign during World War II remains one of the most debated chapters in papal history. Some argue he worked quietly, instructing monasteries and convents to hide Jewish refugees. Others contend he should have spoken with louder, clearer condemnation. The archives continue to be studied. Historians sift through letters and memoranda, seeking nuance. It is a reminder that leadership in times of terror involves agonizing choices: when to speak, when silence might protect lives, when words might provoke greater violence. In the later 20th century, scrutiny shifted toward internal crises. Revelations of abuse within the church deeply shook trust in its leadership. Critics questioned whether certain popes responded swiftly and transparently enough. The pain of victims demanded acknowledgement and reform. Institutions, like individuals, must confront their failures. And yet, alongside criticism, there were gestures of humility. Pope John Paul II publicly apologized for historical wrongs committed by members of the Church against other Christians, against Jewish communities, against indigenous peoples. Such acts did not erase the past, but they acknowledged it. Perhaps this is the quiet thread running through our nighttime journey. Accountability, however delayed, can still emerge. The phrase "the worst popes" captures attention. It invites judgment, but as we drift toward sleep, let us hold a gentler lens. Each of these men stepped into an office older than any kingdom still standing. They inherited centuries of tradition and expectation. Some rose to the occasion with courage. Others faltered under pressure, temptation, or ambition. Power magnifies flaws, it also magnifies virtues. The bells of Rome have rung for saints and for sinners alike. Marble statues do not move when scandal erupts. The dome of St. Peter's does not tilt when controversy shakes headlines. Time absorbs both glory and disgrace. Picture the Vatican at night now. The windows are dark, Swiss guards stand quietly beneath lamplight. The square lies open and still. Tourists have gone. The echoes of history whisper softly against the colonnades. Somewhere in the long corridors lined with frescoes, archivists once carried documents detailing trials, accusations, reforms, apologies. Ink on parchment, ink on paper, human stories bound together. History remembers the dramatic the cadaver trial, the selling of the papacy, the schism of rival popes. But it also remembers the gradual shifts, reforms enacted, councils convened, structures strengthened. If there is comfort in this slow reflection, it may be this: institutions endure not because they are flawless, but because they adapt, repent, and renew. The worst chapters do not define the entire book. As your breathing grows slower, let the centuries settle like gentle snowfall over Rome. The medieval basilicas stand silent. The Renaissance palaces glow faintly under moonlight. The Tiber flows as it always has, carrying with it memories of triumph and turmoil. No cadaver trials now. No rival claimants shouting anathemas across Europe. Only quiet stone, steady water, and the distant hum of a sleeping city. History's storms have passed for tonight. Let them drift away from you as well. Breathe in peace. Breathe out the weight of judgment. The river keeps flowing. And so do we. And so we continue gently, as though walking beneath cypress trees that have watched Rome for 1,000 years. The night air is cool now. The marble beneath our feet has stored the warmth of the day, but it is fading. The city is quieter than it has been in centuries. No armored horses clatter down these streets. No rival banners flap from palace windows. Only the soft glow of lanterns and the steady breathing of a world at rest. If we step back from individual names and scandals, we begin to see something broader. The papacy, at its worst moments, reflected the age around it. In the early medieval centuries, when law was fragile and loyalty was often secured by blood ties, popes sometimes behaved like feudal lords. When Renaissance Italy celebrated art, wealth, and family ambition, popes sometimes resembled princes. When modern Europe trembled under ideological extremes, popes navigated diplomacy with caution, sometimes to their credit, sometimes to their lasting controversy. The worst were not always the most cruel. Sometimes they were the most careless, sometimes the most political, sometimes the most silent when the world longed for thunder. And yet, there is something almost soothing in realizing that no office, no matter how sacred, escapes the currents of history. Think again of Pope Stephen VI and the strange cadaver trial. It shocks us even now. But it also belongs to a time when legal symbolism was powerful and vengeance was theatrical. The act seems grotesque, yet it unfolded in a world where authority had to be displayed dramatically to be believed. Consider Benedict IX, who reportedly sold the papacy. To modern ears, it sounds impossible. But in an era when noble families treated power like inherited land, the papal office could be entangled in the same web of ownership and exchange. Alexander VI's intrigues, too, were not entirely unique among Renaissance rulers. Courts across Europe simmered with plots, marriages of convenience, and whispered alliances. That he wore the white cassock while playing the political game is what makes his story linger. As you grow sleepier, notice how history becomes less like a courtroom and more like a landscape. We walk across it, we see peaks and valleys. Some peaks shine brightly moments of courage and reform. Some valleys sink into shadow moments of corruption and moral failure. But together they form the terrain. Even in the darkest periods of papal scandal, the wider church continued its rhythms. Farmers knelt in small stone chapels. Monks illuminated manuscripts by candlelight. Pilgrims traveled dusty roads toward shrines. Faith, for many, was not defined by the character of a single man in Rome. That may be one of the quiet lessons of this long story. Institutions are vast. They contain multitudes. The Pope is visible, symbolic, central, but beneath him and beyond him stretches a tapestry of millions of lives. When corruption surfaced, reform often followed. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century strengthened clerical discipline. The Council of Trent in the 16th century clarified doctrine and addressed abuses after the Reformation. In the 20th and 21st centuries, structures for accountability expanded in response to crisis. The pendulum swings, correction answers excess. Now imagine the Vatican archives' long corridors of shelves, temperature-controlled rooms preserving fragile parchment. Within them rest records of trials, letters of apology, diplomatic cables, theological debates. The worst and the best are stored side by side. No page shouts, no parchment trembles. They simply exist. Time has a way of softening outrage into study. If you listen closely in your mind, you might hear the faint rustle of those pages turning. Scholars leaning over desks. Light pooling on wooden tables. Centuries speaking quietly to anyone patient enough to listen. Outside, St. Peter's Square lies open like embracing arms. The colonnades curve gently, designed to welcome. Even after scandals, even after wars and schisms, the architecture remains an invitation. There is something comforting in stone that endures. Perhaps that is why Rome feels eternal. Empires have fallen. Governments have shifted. Popes have risen and stumbled. But the city stands, layered with memory. The phrase, "the worst popes in history," captures our attention because we expect spiritual leaders to rise above ordinary failings. When they do not, the fall feels sharper. Yet in another sense, their failures remind us that leadership does not erase humanity, it amplifies it. Some succumb to ambition. Some to fear, some to pride, a few to silence when courage was demanded. Their stories caution future generations. They whisper warnings across time. Guard your integrity. Power is fleeting. Reputation can outlive your reign. As the night deepens further, let us release the sharp edges of judgment. Picture instead a slow procession of centuries passing beneath the dome of St. Peter's. Candles replaced by oil lamps, then by electric light. Latin chants mingling with the hum of modern microphones. The world outside growing louder, faster, more interconnected. The papacy today is scrutinized instantly by global media. Decisions are analyzed in real time. In earlier centuries, rumors traveled by horse. Now they move at the speed of light. The stakes remain high, the expectations remain immense. And yet, even now, the same ancient rhythms persist. Prayer at dawn, meetings in quiet rooms, the tolling of bells at noon. The worst chapters have not erased the better ones. The cadaver trial did not prevent later reform. The Western schism did not permanently divide the church. Renaissance corruption did not extinguish spiritual renewal. 20th century controversy did not silence future voices of compassion. History flows like the Tiber, sometimes muddy, sometimes clear, always moving. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine standing on a small bridge over that river. The water reflects the moon in silver ripples. It carries leaves, fragments, forgotten things. It carries memories of emperors and popes, of saints and sinners. But it does not stop. You do not need to carry every story with you tonight. Let them float downstream. Let Stephen VI's anger, Benedict IX's recklessness, Alexander VI's intrigue, and the heavy debates of the 20th century slip gently into the current. They are part of the past, studied, remembered, absorbed, above you. The dome rises against the night sky, quiet, steady, unmoved by centuries of praise or criticism. Breathe in the cool Roman air of imagination. Breathe out the weight of history. The bells are silent now. The square is empty. Even the river seems softer, as though it too is ready to rest. The worst moments have passed, the lessons remain. And as Rome sleeps, so can you. And still, softly we go on. The sky above Rome has deepened into that velvety shade just before true midnight. The stars seem closer here, as though they too lean in to listen to the murmurs of history. If you sit quietly on a stone step in your imagination, you might notice something unexpected. The stories of the so-called worst popes do not thunder anymore. They no longer shock the city. They have become echoes, faint impressions pressed into old walls. Time does that. It takes what once felt like crisis and turns it into memory. Think of the Western Schism again, those long years when rival popes claimed authority. In the moment, it must have felt catastrophic, as though unity itself were unraveling. But today, it is a chapter in textbooks, carefully studied and calmly explained. The same is true of the Renaissance scandals. Once whispered with outrage, now discussed with a scholar's measured tone. The Borgia name, once feared, has become almost mythic, half history, half legend. Even the controversies of the modern era, still closer to us, are slowly moving from headlines into archives. There is a strange comfort in this rhythm. It tells us that institutions, like people, pass through seasons. Some seasons are bright with renewal. Others are heavy with missteps. But seasons change. If we wander further into the quiet Vatican gardens, away from marble halls and public squares, we find paths lined with olive trees. Fountains murmur gently. In the stillness, it is easier to reflect. What makes a pope the worst? Is it personal immorality? Political entanglement? Silence in times of horror? Or perhaps the inability to rise above the spirit of their age? And what makes a pope remembered kindly? Courage? Reform? Humility? These questions drift like leaves across still water. The truth is that the papacy carries immense symbolic weight. It represents continuity, an unbroken line stretching back nearly 2 millennia. When a pope falters, the disappointment feels magnified because the office itself stands for something sacred. But sacred offices are still inhabited by human beings. In earlier centuries, the process of choosing a pope was not always serene. Political pressure, bribery, and factional maneuvering sometimes crept into conclaves. Families lobbied. Kingdoms intervened. Promises were made in shadowed corners. Yet over time, reforms strengthened the process. The modern conclave, with its careful procedures and secrecy, reflects lessons learned from those turbulent eras. Mistakes shape safeguards. As you grow heavier with sleep, imagine centuries folding like layers of fabric. The 10th century settles over the 9th. The Renaissance drapes across the medieval. The modern era rests lightly on top. Beneath them all is the same city. The same river. The same bells. The worst popes, controversial as they were, did not erase faith from the hearts of ordinary people. They did not stop children from being baptized, or couples from marrying, or the dying from receiving comfort. Life continued. In distant villages far from Rome, believers may not even have known the details of papal scandals. They tended fields, raised families, lit candles in small chapels. The world of high politics often feels large in history books, but small in daily life. This too is comforting. Institutions may tremble at the top, but the roots often hold steady. If you listen carefully now, you might hear a faint choir somewhere in the city, rehearsing softly in the dark. The sound floats through narrow streets and dissolves into the night air. It is neither triumphant nor sorrowful, just steady. Steadiness is what remains after controversy fades. Some of the popes once branded as disastrous were later reassessed with nuance. Historians discovered exaggerations in hostile accounts. Others, once defended, were reconsidered in light of new evidence. History breathes. It expands and contracts as understanding grows. There is something gentle about that realization. It means that even judgment is not fixed forever. It evolves. Perhaps that is the final quiet lesson of our long journey. The worst chapters are rarely the whole story. A cadaver trial shocks us, but it also shows how far institutions can fall, and therefore how far they can rise again. A sold papacy scandalizes us, but it also underscores the importance of reform. A divided church teaches the value of unity. A controversial silence challenges future leaders to speak more clearly. The night in Rome is nearly complete now. Soon, faint light will brush the edges of rooftops. The first birds will stir. A new day will begin, as it has after every crisis, every scandal, every reform. The dome of St. Peter's will glow pale gold in the morning sun, indifferent to the centuries of argument that have swirled beneath it. The Tiber will continue its slow, patient journey to the sea. And you, listening in the quiet of your own space, can let these stories settle like dust after a long procession. No need to carry the weight of judgment. No need to resolve every debate. Just the gentle awareness that history is human. That even the highest offices can stumble. That renewal often follows failure. The bells will ring again tomorrow. For now they rest. The river flows, the city sleeps. And so softly can you. And in the final stretch of our quiet wandering, the night feels softer than before, like velvet drawn across the sky. Rome is still. The great dome stands watch, not as a symbol of scandal or triumph, but simply as stone shaped by human hands. Around it, centuries breathe in and out like a sleeping giant. If you look back over all we have drifted through, the cadaver trial, the bought papacy, the rival claimants, the Renaissance intrigues, the modern controversies, you may notice something subtle. None of those moments lasted forever. Each felt enormous in its time. Each stirred anger, confusion, or disappointment. And yet, each eventually gave way to another chapter. History moves with a patience that we sometimes forget to practice. Imagine now the very early morning hours. A faint silver line appears at the horizon. The Vatican gardens are hushed. Dew gathers on leaves. Somewhere a single light flicks on in a quiet room where a cleric begins his day before dawn. The worst popes in history, those whose names became synonymous with controversy, are no longer living forces. They are figures in books, subjects of documentaries. Topics for historians debating fine details of context and consequence. Their power has dissolved into narrative. That is the great equalizer of time. In their lifetimes, some wielded armies. Some influenced kings. Some sparked divisions across continents. But now they rest like all others, reduced to memory, their legacies shaped by those who study them. And the institution they once led continues in forms they could scarcely imagine. Satellites orbit overhead. Messages travel instantly. The modern world hums with speed. Yet in Rome, ancient prayers are still spoken in quiet chapels. Continuity does not mean perfection, it means persistence. The idea of the worst often captures our curiosity because it highlights contrast. We expect moral clarity from spiritual leadership. When it falters, the contrast feels stark. But perhaps the deeper story is not about ranking failures. Perhaps it is about endurance. The papacy has been tested by greed, by violence, by political entanglement, by ideological storms. And each time it has shifted shape, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes boldly. Reform has often emerged from crisis. After corruption, calls for discipline. After division, counsels for unity. After silence, demands for transparency. It is a rhythm as old as institutions themselves. Now the sky lightens further. Pale blue replaces black. The first bells begin to stir, not loudly, just a gentle toll marking the passage of night into morning. The stones of St. Peter's Square glow faintly in the growing light. Columns cast long, graceful shadows. The city is not dramatic in this hour. It is peaceful. And that peace feels earned. The worst popes are part of a vast tapestry woven with both gold and darker threads. Pull one thread out, and the picture would change. But together, they form the complex story of a 2,000-year-old institution, navigating a very human world. As you let your thoughts grow slower, imagine placing all those names, Stephen, Benedict, John, Alexander, Leo, Pius, into a quiet library shelf. Their volumes close gently. Dust settles. The stories remain available for those who seek them, but they no longer demand your attention tonight. The river keeps flowing. The morning arrives whether scandal once raged or not. And perhaps that is the most soothing truth of all. History is vast, but this moment is small and calm. You are not standing in a medieval courtroom or a Renaissance palace. You are here, safe, listening to distant echoes that cannot harm you. The worst chapters have already passed. The bells ring a little clearer now. A soft golden hue brushes the dome. Pigeons flutter across the square, their wings catching the first light. Rome wakes gently. Let your own thoughts fade the same way the night does, gradually, without resistance. The stories settle. The city breathes. The river flows toward the sea. And in this quiet dawn beyond centuries of turmoil, there is only stillness. Rest now. And as the light strengthens, it does not erase the night, it simply transforms it. The sky above Rome turns from pale silver to soft gold. Windows catch the sunrise one by one. The great dome gleams, not as a monument to any single pope good or bad, but as a testament to endurance. Beneath it, generations have come and gone, each believing their moment was the most decisive, the most urgent. Yet morning always arrives quietly. If we linger a little longer in this calm space, we can see the full arc of what we have traced together. The papacy has known chaos so strange it bordered on the unbelievable, a trial of a corpse, rival claimants splitting Christendom, a young pontiff accused of recklessness, a Renaissance court tangled in ambition. It has known moments of silence that later generations questioned. It has known power and the loss of power. And still, here stands Rome. There is something deeply human in that pattern. Institutions reflect the strengths and weaknesses of those who guide them. No office, however sacred, floats above the gravity of human nature. Pride can enter marble halls just as easily as humility. Fear can sit beside courage. Ambition can whisper even in sacred chambers, but so can repentance. So can reform. When people speak of the worst popes, they often focus on the dramatic stories, the shocking acts, the political games, the moral failings. Those stories carry weight because they remind us how high expectations were placed on these leaders. The disappointment was sharp precisely because the office symbolized something holy. And yet, the same institution that weathered scandal also nurtured saints, scholars, artists, and reformers. The Renaissance popes who reveled in splendor also commissioned works that still inspire awe. The popes who struggled with political entanglement also helped shape diplomacy that prevented wider conflict. Even controversial figures existed within broader systems that continued to serve communities across continents. History rarely hands us simple villains or heroes. It gives us complexity. Now imagine the streets of Rome filling slowly with ordinary life. A baker opens a shop. A cleaner sweeps stone steps. Tourists will soon enter the square, unaware of the centuries layered beneath their feet. Life resumes its quiet, everyday rhythm. And this is perhaps the gentlest conclusion of all. The drama of history eventually dissolves into daily life. The worst scandals fade into archives. The fiercest arguments settle into footnotes. What remains are the steady patterns of prayer, conversation, work, and hope. The papacy today stands very different from its medieval form. Transparent processes, global communication, structured governance, these evolved because history demanded growth. Each crisis became a teacher. Each misstep forced reflection. If we listen closely, the lessons are soft but persistent. Power requires accountability. Authority requires humility. Leadership requires courage. Without these, even the highest throne can tremble. But with them, even a wounded institution can heal. The sun now rises fully over Rome. The dome shines bright. The square fills with light. The long shadows retreat. The worst popes are no longer looming figures in candlelit halls. They are names in history, reminders of the fragility of virtue when mixed with power. They are cautionary tales, yes, but also proof that endurance is possible. Because the story did not end with them, it continued, and it continues still. As you rest in this final moment of calm, let the centuries fall away entirely. No more scandals, no more rival claimants. No more intrigue, just morning light touching ancient stone. Just a river flowing without hurry, just bells ringing into clear air. History has spoken softly through the night, now it grows quiet. The city stands, the dome glows, the river moves on. And in this peaceful dawn beyond controversy and centuries, there is only stillness. You can rest there now. And now, as morning fully opens its golden eyes over Rome, we continue not with urgency, not with scandal, but with the long, slow breath of time itself. The sun warms the stone steps of St. Peter's Square. The light creeps across statues of saints who gaze down from the colonnades, their faces carved in expressions that have watched centuries unfold. They have seen corruption and courage alike. They have seen papal coronations and funerals. They have seen crowds cheering and crowds protesting, and still they remain silent witnesses. If we widen our view even further, we begin to understand that the story of the worst popes is also the story of expectations placed upon human leaders. The papacy was never meant to be merely political, yet politics constantly circled it. It was never meant to be a throne of luxury, yet wealth flowed toward it in certain ages. It was meant to guide souls, but souls live in a world shaped by kings, wars, economies, and ambition. This tension never fully disappears. In the Middle Ages, when Europe was fragmented into kingdoms and duchies, the Pope often served as an arbiter between rulers. Sometimes that role required diplomacy. Sometimes it tempted domination. Some popes became too entangled in territorial disputes, behaving like princes of Italy rather than shepherds of faith. Critics then, as now, wondered whether spiritual authority was being overshadowed by temporal ambition. But history, like the Tiber, has curves. After eras of excess, waves of reform rose up. Monastic movements sought simplicity. Councils gathered bishops to clarify teachings and discipline. Saints emerged not from palaces but from humble places, reminding the faithful that holiness does not depend on the perfection of leadership. Even during the Avignon papacy, when critics lamented French influence and administrative excess, mystics and reformers were writing letters, calling for a renewal. Catherine of Siena urged the Pope to return to Rome. Her voice, gentle yet firm, showed that even in times of perceived decline, conscience remained alive. It is easy to remember the popes who faltered. Harder, sometimes, to remember the countless unnamed believers who quietly preserved their faith through those storms. Imagine a small stone chapel in a distant village during the Western Schism. The priest may not have known which claimant to the papacy was legitimate. But he still rang the bell. He still read scripture. He still comforted the sick. The confusion at the top did not extinguish devotion at the roots. That is how institutions endure. When the Renaissance popes adorned Rome with art and architecture sometimes criticized for extravagance, they also left behind beauty that continues to inspire millions. Michelangelo's ceiling still lifts eyes upward. The dome still inspires awe. Art born in complicated circumstances now offers quiet wonder. History can redeem even flawed chapters by transforming their outcomes. In the 20th century, when the world trembled under total war, the Vatican became a place of tense diplomacy. Decisions were weighed carefully, words were chosen cautiously. Some judged those choices harshly, others defended them. The debates continue in academic halls and published works. Yet the world moved forward. New popes addressed new challenges: globalization, technological change, cultural shifts. The papacy became more visible than ever, traveling continents, speaking to diverse audiences, addressing not only Catholics but the broader human family. And through it all, the shadows of past failures remained reminders, not chains, but cautionary signs. Perhaps that is why the phrase, "the worst popes," feels so powerful. It reminds us that even sacred leadership is not immune to weakness. It humbles grand narratives. It warns against blind idealization, but it also reveals resilience. If the papacy had collapsed under the weight of its worst moments, the story would have ended centuries ago. Instead, it adapted. Procedures strengthened. Transparency increased. Dialogue expanded. Imagine the Vatican Library again, its long rows of texts, manuscripts from ancient times to modern scholarship. Among them are criticisms, defenses, apologies, reforms. The Church's history is not hidden from study. It is examined, debated, sometimes painfully. And that openness to examination is itself a sign of growth. Now the city is fully awake. The murmur of voices fills the square. Cameras click. Guides explain history in many languages. Few pause to consider that the ground beneath them once trembled under fierce disputes. Yet those disputes shaped the very structures they admire. Time turns crisis into foundation. If you walk slowly along the Tiber in your imagination, you see how the water reflects both sky and stone. It carries no anger. It does not cling to memory. It flows forward. The worst popes belong to that flow now. Their names drift through lectures and documentaries, through discussions of ethics and power. They serve as reminders that institutions are living things, shaped by human choice. And perhaps, as the sun climbs higher, a softer realization emerges. History is not merely about condemnation, it is about understanding. Understanding how ambition can distort good intentions. Understanding how fear can silence voices. Understanding how reform often grows from failure. Without acknowledging mistakes, growth is impossible. Without remembering errors, repetition becomes likely. So even the darkest chapters hold value not because they are admirable, but because they are instructive. The bells ring again at midday. Their sound is steady and clear. It spreads across rooftops and down narrow streets. It echoes off ancient walls that have heard everything before, and nothing collapses. The dome stands, the river flows, the square fills and empties again. As afternoon softens toward evening once more, you may feel the rhythm completing a circle. We began in night, wandering through shadows of history. We moved toward dawn, toward reflection. Now as light begins to mellow, there is a sense of balance. The worst popes were chapters, not conclusions. They were storms, not the climate. They were moments when human frailty showed through sacred office. But they did not erase the centuries before them, nor the centuries after. If you sit quietly in this imagined Rome at dusk, a sky of amber, you might notice how peaceful it feels despite everything that once occurred here. That peace was not born of perfection. It was born of endurance. History breathes in cycles. Scandal and reform. Division and reconciliation. Failure and renewal. And through it all, life continues. The lamps are being lit again now as evening approaches. The square grows quieter. The river reflects streaks of orange and violet. The dome glows softly against the fading light. We have traveled far across centuries of turbulence and reflection, and now, once more, Rome settles into stillness. The stories of the worst popes no longer loom large. They rest gently within the vast library of time. The city exhales. The river moves steadily toward the sea. And above it all, the sky darkens once more, not in foreboding, but in calm. History sleeps. Rome rests. And you too can let the long journey fade into quiet. And so the long evening settles again, as though the entire city has decided to breathe more slowly. The sky over Rome deepens from amber to rose, from rose to violet, from violet to that familiar velvet blue that began our journey. Lamps flicker on beneath archways. The hum of conversation softens. Footsteps echo lightly on stone. A breeze moves gently across the Tiber, brushing its surface into ripples that catch the last of the light. If we stand once more in St. Peter's Square, we can feel how small one lifetime truly is compared to the centuries layered here. The worst popes, those whose actions caused scandal or division, lived intensely within their own brief spans. They made decisions that felt urgent, decisive, even absolute. Yet from this wide vantage point, their reigns appear like brief flashes in a very long night. What once seemed overwhelming now feels contained. And perhaps that is the quiet wisdom history offers. Perspective softens intensity. Consider again how expectation shapes disappointment. The papacy was entrusted with spiritual authority, moral guidance, unity. When leaders failed in those responsibilities through corruption, political ambition, personal vice, or silence, the contrast felt stark. The higher the calling, the sharper the fall. But the office itself was never meant to eliminate human frailty. It was meant to guide through it. In every era, the Pope stood at a crossroads between heaven and earth, between prayer and policy, between contemplation and negotiation. Some leaned too far into earthly power. Others retreated too cautiously into silence. Some misjudged the tides of their time. Some succumbed to temptation that might have undone anyone placed in such an elevated position. And yet, no single failure ended the story. During the darkest medieval decades, reform movements germinated quietly in monasteries. During the Renaissance intrigues, artists painted ceilings that lifted eyes toward eternity. During the Schism, councils slowly labored toward unity. During modern crises, new structures of accountability took shape. Failure did not have the final word. Imagine for a moment the weight of the papal tiara in earlier centuries heavy, jeweled, symbolic of spiritual and temporal authority. It must have pressed against the brow like a reminder of immense responsibility. To where it was to stand at the intersection of faith and politics, expectation and reality. Today, the tiara is no longer worn. Symbols change. Rituals adapt. Even this subtle shift reflects lessons learned across time. The Church, like any ancient institution, carries scars. But scars are signs of healing after wounds. They are evidence that something endured pain and survived. If you wander now into the quieter streets behind the Vatican walls, you may notice how ordinary everything feels. Laundry hangs from balconies, a cat crosses a narrow alley, a cafe closes its shutters for the night. Life unfolds without reference to centuries of controversy. This ordinariness is reassuring. It reminds us that history's grand dramas eventually dissolve into everyday existence. Somewhere in the Vatican library, perhaps, a scholar continues reading about the Cadaver Synod. Elsewhere, another researches the Western Schism. Another examines wartime correspondence. Their work is steady, methodical, not angry, not sensational, just patient. Patience is the companion of truth. Over time, documents clarify exaggerations, Motives become more complex. Narratives shift from outrage to understanding. Even the worst reputations sometimes soften under careful study, while other failings become clearer in light of evidence. This is the quiet labor of history. As night deepens once more, the dome of St. Peter's glows against the dark sky. Its silhouette is familiar now. It has watched our entire journey from scandal to reflection to renewal. The bells ring softly in the distance, not in alarm, not in celebration, simply marking time. That is what remains when drama fades, the steady marking of hours. The worst popes were part of that marking. Their reigns were hours, sometimes troubled hours, sometimes turbulent, but they were not the whole day, and certainly not the whole story. If you imagine tracing a line from the earliest bishops of Rome to the present day, it would stretch like a thread through countless storms and calm seas. Along that thread are not moments of tension and controversy, but the thread itself remains unbroken. Continuity is not perfection, it is persistence. And perhaps the deepest comfort of all lies here. Institutions like people can learn. They can refine processes, they can confront mistakes. They can evolve while still holding on to core identity. The papacy that once staged a grotesque trial of a corpse now operates within frameworks of law and global scrutiny unimaginable to that era. The office that once became entangled in Renaissance family intrigue now faces transparency in a world connected by instant communication. History does not freeze institutions in their worst moments. It invites transformation. The night is quiet again now. The square is empty, the fountains murmur gently. The river flows with that same patient rhythm that has outlasted emperors and popes alike. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the centuries breathing slow, deep, unhurried. We have wandered through corruption and reform, silence and speech, division and reconciliation. And through it all, Rome has remained a place of stone and sky, of bells and water. The worst chapters are folded neatly into the vast book of time. They no longer shout, they no longer shock. They rest. And in their resting, they offer lessons about humility, accountability, the dangers of unchecked power, and the resilience of communities that endure beyond flawed leadership. The stars are bright now. The air is cool. The dome stands serene. History, having told its long story, grows quiet once more. The river keeps flowing, the bells keep marking time. The city sleeps without fear of its past. And as the centuries settle like gentle dust upon ancient stone, there is only stillness. Rest in that stillness. Have you ever wondered how an institution, nearly 2,000 years old, has not only survived but thrived through centuries of turmoil, scandal, and reinvention? The story of the papacy isn't just a tale of saints and sinners, but a profound lesson in resilience. It's a journey through the deep currents of history, where even the darkest moments became seeds for incredible transformation. Let's start in the so-called Dark Ages. After the fall of Rome, the world was a fractured and violent place. Warlords carved up territories, and chaos reigned. In this power vacuum, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became more than just a spiritual leader. He became a beacon of stability, a diplomat, a governor. The church began to accumulate land and power, not out of greed, but out of necessity. It was a matter of survival, providing order where there was none. This period laid the groundwork for the papacy as a major political force in Europe, a role that would define its history for the next 1,000 years. But with great power comes great temptation. As we move into the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we encounter a period often called the pornocracy, or the rule of harlots. This was a time when powerful Roman families vied for control of the papacy, treating it like a personal kingdom. Popes were installed and deposed based on political alliances and family ties. Stories of corruption, nepotism, and moral decay were rampant. It seemed as if the spiritual mission of the church had been completely lost, overshadowed by worldly ambition. For many, it felt like the end. How could an institution so mired in scandal claim any moral authority? This was the absolute low point, a time when the papacy's survival seemed truly in doubt. Yet, history has a strange way of course-correcting. The very excesses of this era sparked a powerful reaction. From within the church, voices of reform began to rise. Figures like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and later Catherine of Siena called for a return to piety and a rejection of worldly power. These movements were like small streams, slowly gathering force. The corruption became so undeniable that it couldn't be ignored. This internal pressure for change led to the Gregorian reforms in the 11th century, a sweeping effort to combat simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and to enforce clerical celibacy. It was a clear sign that the institution could, in fact, police itself. It was the beginning of a long, slow process of separating the spiritual from the temporal. The church was learning that its true strength wasn't in armies or land, but in its moral and spiritual foundation. Then came the Renaissance, a period of breathtaking artistic and intellectual achievement, but also one of incredible papal indulgence. The popes of this era, like Julius II and Leo X, were great patrons of the arts. We have them to thank for Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica. But this grandeur came at a cost. To fund these massive projects, the church ramped up the sale of indulgences, promising remission of sin for a price. This was the final straw for a German monk named Martin Luther. His 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in Wittenberg, weren't just a theological argument. They were a cry of outrage against a system that seemed to have monetized salvation. The Protestant Reformation that followed was the greatest crisis the papacy had ever faced. It shattered the unity of Western Christendom. Kingdoms broke away, and Europe was plunged into decades of religious warfare. From the perspective of Rome, it was a catastrophe. But again, this crisis forced a period of profound self-reflection. The response was the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, convened over nearly 2 decades, was a monumental undertaking. It clarified church doctrine, condemned corruption, and established seminaries to properly educate priests. The church didn't just fight back. It reformed from within. It re-emerged from the ashes of the Reformation more disciplined, more focused on its pastoral mission, and with a renewed sense of purpose. The crisis had forced it to become a better version of itself. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of reason, revolution, and nationalism. The old order was collapsing. The French Revolution saw the church brutally suppressed, its property confiscated, and priests executed. Napoleon Bonaparte humiliated the papacy, even taking Pope Pius VII prisoner. Later, the unification of Italy stripped the Pope of his final territories, the Papal States, leaving him a self-declared prisoner in the Vatican. For many observers, this was surely the end. The papacy had lost all its temporal power. It was an anachronism in a modern world of nation-states and secular ideologies. How could it possibly survive? And yet, something remarkable happened. By losing its worldly kingdom, the papacy found its spiritual voice again, with greater clarity than it had in centuries. Stripped of political power, the popes of the late 19th and 20th centuries focused on moral and social teachings. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum addressed the rights of industrial workers, laying the foundation for modern Catholic social teaching. The papacy transformed from a political player into a global moral conscience. The loss of temporal power was not a defeat, but a liberation. It allowed the institution to transcend national politics and speak to all of humanity. Think about the papacy in our own time. From Pope John Paul II challenging communism to Pope Francis speaking on climate change and economic inequality, the office continues to hold a unique place on the world stage. It has no armies, no vast territories. Its power is purely soft power, the power of words, of moral persuasion. And its influence remains immense. This journey, from Roman governors to Renaissance princes, from prisoners in the Vatican to global moral leaders, is a testament to an incredible capacity for adaptation and renewal. What does this long, winding history teach us? It shows that institutions, like people, are not defined by their failures but by how they respond to them. The papacy's worst moments were often the very catalysts for its most significant growth. It's a story of patience, of understanding that history moves not in sprints, but in a slow, steady, and often imperceptible flow. It's a reminder that true strength lies not in worldly power, but in the resilience of an idea. The story of the popes is, in the end, a story of enduring faith, not just faith in God, but faith in the capacity for reform, renewal, and the quiet, unstoppable march of history itself. Thanks for joining us on this journey. If you found this story of resilience as fascinating as we do, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time. And still we linger, because the night is generous and history is deep, and there is no rush in a city that has already waited 2,000 years. The stars above Rome feel older than every controversy we have spoken of. They shone over the Forum when emperors ruled. They shone over the Lateran Palace when factions plotted. They shone over Avignon when rival courts competed for loyalty. They shone over battlefields, councils, coronations, and quiet chapels alike. They do not flicker differently for scandal. They simply shine. If we walk once more along the curve of the colonnade in St. Peter's Square, we might trace our fingers along the cool stone. Each column stands shoulder to shoulder with the next, forming a great embrace. Bernini designed it that way, arms open wide. It is a fitting image. Because despite the failures of certain leaders, the broader story was always larger than one man. The worst popes, controversial and flawed as they were, stood inside a structure sustained by countless others: cardinals, bishops, priests, monks, nuns, scholars, and ordinary believers across continents. Even when leadership faltered, community endured. Think of the centuries when communication was slow. A scandal in Rome might take months to reach distant lands. And by the time it did, local communities had already formed their own rhythms of faith. The church was never only the Vatican. It was villages, cathedrals, deserts, forests, mountains. It was whispered prayers and sung hymns, and quiet acts of mercy. Those rhythms did not stop because a pope erred. And so the story of the worst popes becomes less a tale of collapse, and more a reminder of how broad the foundation truly was. Institutions that rely solely on one personality crumble quickly. Institutions rooted in shared belief and distributed practice survive turbulence. The papacy endured precisely because it was never alone. As we move deeper into this long, unhurried reflection, imagine standing inside St. Peter's Basilica when it is nearly empty. The vast interior feels almost like a cavern of light and shadow. Footsteps echo gently. The ceiling rises impossibly high. Under that ceiling lie tombs of popes, some revered, some debated, some nearly forgotten. Marble does not distinguish between the celebrated and the controversial. It holds them all with equal stillness. Death, in the end, equalizes reputation. The scandals that once seemed unbearable become small lines etched into stone. The political maneuverings that once stirred entire kingdoms now rest quietly beneath inscriptions that most visitors pass without notice. Time is the great quieting force. If you listen closely in this imagined basilica, you might hear only a faint rustle, the distant turning of pages, the soft shuffle of a caretaker, the almost inaudible whisper of air moving through vast space. No argument, no accusation, no defense. Just stillness. Perhaps that is the final transformation of history. What was once loud becomes quiet. What was once divisive becomes studied. What was once painful becomes instructive. The worst popes in history now belong to scholars and storytellers, not to active crisis. Their choices have already played out. Their consequences have already unfolded. Nothing they did can surprise the present anymore. Outside, the river continues its patient course. Imagine how many times it has reflected flames from torches carried in processions of protest. It simply moves forward. And so does time. As the night stretches gently onward, the air cools further. A faint mist begins to gather near the riverbanks. The city feels almost suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. In that suspension, there is peace. We began this long journey exploring the worst popes' names often attached to scandal, ambition, division, controversy. Yet what remains now is not outrage, but understanding. They were human. They were shaped by their eras. They were given immense power, sometimes too young, sometimes too entangled in politics, sometimes too cautious, sometimes too bold. And their stories remind us of something universal. No title guarantees virtue. No office eliminates frailty. But also no failure permanently erases the possibility of renewal. The papacy learned, slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but undeniably. Procedures became clearer. Elections became more guarded. Governance became more structured. Transparency became more valued. It is not perfection. It is progression. Now, as the horizon hints at the faintest suggestion of another coming dawn, you may notice how gentle everything feels. The dome is only a silhouette now. The square is empty. Even the river seems quieter, as though honoring the stillness. History has completed another circle, from night to morning, from scandal to reflection, from turbulence to calm. The worst chapters have been folded into the greater narrative. They no longer demand emotion. They offer perspective. And perspective is peaceful. The bells will ring again soon, not to announce crisis, but simply to mark another day. Rome will wake. Tourists will gather. Guides will speak. scholars will write. Believers will pray, critics will analyze, supporters will defend. Life will continue, because it always does. And in this final stretch of quiet, beneath a sky that has watched every pope come and go, there is only the steady, reassuring rhythm of endurance. The stones remain. The river flows. The sky stretches endlessly overhead. The worst moments have long since passed into memory. All that is left now is calm. Let the calm settle. Let the centuries rest. Let the story close gently, like a heavy book placed softly back upon its shelf. And in the vast, quiet space that remains, be still. And still the night holds us, not because there is more scandal to uncover, but because there is something soothing about walking slowly through centuries without urgency. Rome is quiet again. The cycle repeats itself, darkness wrapping gently around domes and rooftops, the river breathing its slow rhythm beneath ancient bridges. Time feels circular here, not linear. It turns and returns like the tolling of a bell that fades only to sound again. If we look back across everything we have wandered through, the dramatic moments no longer feel sharp. They feel distant. The cadaver synod becomes less a horror and more a strange relic of a chaotic age. The rival popes of the Western Schism become symbols of a world still learning how to hold unity. The Renaissance intrigues soften into stories told under lamplight. The modern controversies become chapters in ongoing conversations about accountability and reform. Distance gentles even the harshest narratives. Imagine standing on the highest terrace overlooking the Vatican gardens. From here, the city feels smaller, the streets form patterns. The lights resemble constellations fallen to earth. Somewhere below, guards change shifts. Somewhere else, a window glows briefly before going dark. Life continues in small, ordinary ways. That is what history often forgets to emphasize, the ordinariness that persists beneath extraordinary headlines. While one pope maneuvered politically, thousands of ordinary priests heard confessions. While rival claimants argued legitimacy, families baptized newborns. While Renaissance courts feasted, monks copied manuscripts in quiet rooms. While global wars raged and leaders debated diplomacy, candles were still lit in small chapels around the world. The story was never only about the man on the throne. And so the worst popes, though memorable, were threads in a vast tapestry. Pull one thread and you alter the pattern, yes, but the entire cloth remains. As the hours pass, the air grows cooler. The marble of St. Peter's Square releases the last warmth of the day. The fountains murmur continuously, unchanged by centuries of human drama. Water arcs upward and falls again, over and over, patient and predictable. There is comfort in repetition. History often feels turbulent when we focus on moments. But when we widen our lens, we see rhythm instead of chaos. Rise and fall, error and correction, division and reunion. Each era believed itself to be at a breaking point, and yet the world did not break. The papacy did not dissolve after its worst moments. It recalibrated. It reflected. It reformed, sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, but undeniably. Perhaps that is why Rome feels peaceful tonight. It has survived its storms. The dome of St. Peter's does not carry visible cracks from political intrigue. The river does not flow faster because of past corruption. The sky does not darken in memory of controversy. Nature does not cling to scandal. And maybe that is the deeper calm beneath this long story. Time itself is forgiving. Not in the sense that it erases wrongdoing, but in the sense that it absorbs it into a larger context. What once felt like a defining catastrophe becomes one movement in a much longer symphony. The worst popes once commanded attention across continents. Today, their names are footnotes for many, research topics for some, bedtime stories for a quiet listener like you. Their urgency has faded, and that fading is gentle. Imagine now that dawn approaches once more, not dramatically, just subtly. A thin line of gray touches the horizon. The night birds grow quiet. The earliest morning sounds begin to stir. This is how history moves, not with thunder, but with gradual light. If you think of the papacy as a lighthouse, there were times when its light flickered. Times when the glass was clouded by human weakness. Times when storms battered its foundation. But the structure was reinforced. The glass was cleaned. The light steadied again. Not because leaders were flawless, but because lessons accumulated. The worst popes, then, become part of that accumulation. They are reminders carved into memory. Beware of unchecked ambition. Beware of pride. Beware of silence when courage is needed. Remember that authority must be balanced with humility. Without those reminders, institutions risk repeating their errors. The sky brightens further. The dome shifts from shadow to silhouette to gentle illumination. A bird crosses the square. A faint bell rings, marking another beginning. And with this beginning comes the quiet truth that has unfolded across our long, slow journey. History is not defined by its worst moments. It is shaped by how it responds to them. Rome responded. The papacy responded. Reform followed turmoil. Renewal followed division. And now in this imagined early morning, there is nothing left to analyze. The stones are calm. The river flows. The sky opens wide. The worst chapters rest peacefully within the greater story. You have walked through centuries without leaving your seat. You have watched storms pass without feeling their wind. You have seen power rise and fall without danger. And now, like the city itself, you can rest in the steady assurance that time continues patient and unhurried. The bells ring softly. The light spreads gently. The river keeps moving toward the sea. History breathes. And in that breath, stillness. And as that stillness settles more deeply, something almost weightless fills the air. The long journey through centuries has slowed to a whisper. The dramatic edges have softened completely now. The names that once carried shock, Stephen, Benedict, John, Alexander, no longer echo with intensity. They sit quietly in the vast archive of time, no louder than the rustle of leaves in the Vatican gardens. The sky is pale again, hovering between night and morning. Rome seems suspended in a moment that belongs neither to yesterday nor tomorrow. If you stand once more beside the Tiber, you might notice how steady it feels. It does not hurry toward the sea. It does not hesitate. It carries fragments of history invisibly within it, memories dissolved into motion. Water never clings. And perhaps that is how we can leave this long reflection. The worst popes were once at the center of storms of politics, ambition, controversy, fear. But storms do not last forever. They exhaust themselves. They pass over stone and river alike. What remains is structure. What remains is continuity. What remains is the quiet rhythm of bells marking hours that are no longer dramatic. Imagine the great doors of St. Peter's slowly opening with the first light of day. The interior fills gradually with brightness. Gold glimmers, marble glows. The vastness of the space feels peaceful rather than imposing. The tombs below remain silent. History rests. It does not demand outrage from you tonight. It does not require judgment. It simply exists layered, complex, human. If there is a final thread tying all of this together, it is this. Imperfection did not end the story. It shaped it. The worst leaders did not freeze time. They became part of the lesson time carried forward. The church learned from its darkest chapters. Structures strengthened. Reflection deepened. Expectations evolved. Transparency grew. The very fact that we can look back and speak of the worst proves that moral standards persisted. Critique itself is a sign of conscience, and conscience is a sign of life. Now the sun rises gently, brushing the dome with gold. The square begins to fill again with quiet movement. A child laughs somewhere in the distance. A bell rings, steady and clear. Nothing in this morning reveals the turbulence of past centuries. Nothing trembles under the memory of scandal. Rome simply lives. That is the enduring comfort. Life continues beyond failure. The worst chapters are not erased, but they are absorbed. Absorbed into stone. Absorbed into scholarship. Absorbed into reform. And eventually, absorbed into calm. You have wandered through medieval intrigue, Renaissance ambition, modern controversy, and slow renewal. And at the end of it all, there is no thunder, only a quiet city waking under a wide sky. The river flows forward without looking back. The dome stands without apology. The bells ring without fear. And in this final hush, there is nothing left to add. Only the steady, peaceful movement of time carrying everything good and bad toward a horizon that never stops widening. Rest in that horizon. Rest in the calm that follows every storm. Rest in the simple truth that history continues, and so do we. The morning has now fully unfolded, though it does so without urgency. Light pours across the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square, stretching long shadows that slowly shorten as the sun climbs. Pilgrims begin to gather, not in crowds yet, but in scattered twos and threes. Their footsteps are soft. Their voices carry gently in the cool air. History no longer presses upon you. It drifts behind like a fading dream. The worst popes, those whose names once sparked outrage, disbelief, or sorrow have settled into the wide field of memory. They are no longer figures of sharp controversy. They are distant shapes in the landscape of centuries. It is strange how time does that. What once felt explosive becomes archival. What once seemed unforgivable becomes studied. What once shocked becomes contextualized. The bells begin their measured toll. Not loud, not dramatic, simply steady. There were centuries when those bells rang in fear. Centuries when rival claimants declared themselves pope. Centuries when armies stood at the gates. When corruption seeped into sacred halls. When reformers pleaded for renewal. When power overshadowed humility. Yet this morning, none of that tension remains in the air. A soft breeze moves through the square. Somewhere in the Vatican gardens, leaves shift and settle again. The great dome watches over it all, not as a symbol of triumph, nor as a monument to perfection, but as a witness. A witness to fragility and resilience alike. Consider how many institutions would have fractured completely under such strain. Political systems have collapsed, kingdoms have dissolved, dynasties have vanished. And yet here stands an institution that endured popes who were weak, arrogant, scandal-ridden, or disastrously political. It endured because it was never just one man. That is perhaps the most calming realization of all. The office continued even when its holder faltered. The faithful continued even when leadership stumbled. The structure bent, but it did not break. In the quiet of this morning, you can almost feel the layers of reform that followed each dark chapter. Councils convened, laws adjusted, safeguards strengthened. Spiritual renewal movements rose and fell like tides. History did not move in a straight line upward, it moved in waves. And waves, even when turbulent, return to stillness. You walk now along a narrow Roman street. The stone walls hold centuries of whispers, small windows open. A baker prepares bread, a shopkeeper lifts a metal shutter. Ordinary life persists. That persistence is more powerful than scandal. The worst popes were extraordinary in their failures, but ordinary life outlasted them. And perhaps that is the most soothing thought for sleep. No single era defines the whole. The Renaissance intrigues, the medieval rivalries, the modern controversies, each was a chapter, not the book itself. You pass a fountain. Water spills gently into a shallow basin. Its rhythm is simple and repetitive. A sound feels almost like breathing. Inhale, exhale. History inhales conflict. History exhales reform. Inhale, exhale. The rhythm continues. If you look upward, the sky has shifted from pale blue to a deeper shade. Clouds drift lazily, unconcerned with centuries of human ambition. Time has thinned the sharp edges of the past. What remains is perspective. The so-called worst popes were not monsters from myth. They were men shaped by their era's flawed, pressured, tempted, sometimes disastrously so. Some were overwhelmed by political forces. Some embraced worldly power too eagerly. Some misjudged the responsibilities of spiritual leadership. But none halted the turning of the earth. The church moved through them as the river moves around stones. Stones disturb the current briefly. The river continues. A distant choir rehearsal begins somewhere inside the basilica. The notes are faint, rising and falling in gentle harmony. Even sound seems softer now. The story has lost its urgency. There is no villain to chase, no scandal to dissect further. Only distance. And distance is a gift for sleep. You sit on a quiet bench beneath a cypress tree. The branches sway slightly. Sunlight filters through them in thin golden threads. The long night of storytelling has ended. The dramatic episodes, trial of corpses, rival papal courts, Renaissance excess, political entanglements have all drifted into the background. They no longer demand attention. They rest in the archive. And you can rest too. Because history does not require you to carry its weight tonight. It simply asks to be understood and then gently set down. The bells ring again, marking another hour. An hour like countless others. In this moment, the title worst feels smaller. Less sharp, less heavy. It is merely a human label applied to complex lives long concluded. The sun warms the stone beneath you. The breeze softens. Footsteps fade into the distance. And Rome, eternal and unhurried, continues exactly as it has for millennia, absorbing triumph and failure alike without losing its quiet rhythm. Let the rhythm carry you now. Let the centuries blur into soft shapes. Let the names become whispers rather than headlines. The river flows. The dome stands. The bells mark time. And the world turns steadily onward, carrying every story light and shadow into the wide calm of another peaceful day. There is nothing more to resolve, nothing more to chase. Only the gentle continuation of time itself. And in that continuation there is rest,